It's a photograph that should radiate warmth, a perfect capsule of domestic bliss from the late Victorian era. The image, captured in 1897, depicts a nursery bathed in the soft, forgiving light of a high window. A man with a proud, neatly trimmed mustache stands with a protective hand on the shoulder of his wife, who is seated in a rocking chair, her gaze fixed lovingly on the ornate wooden cradle at her feet. Inside, a swaddled infant lies sleeping, a picture of innocence. The room is filled with the trappings of comfort and privilege: plush rugs, delicate wallpaper adorned with cherubs and beautifully crafted wooden toys, but behind the happy family, mounted on the wall, is a large, gilded mirror. And in its reflection there is something profoundly wrong. The mirror reflects the nursery with perfect clarity, the wallpaper, the window, the corner of the cradle, but the family is not there. Silas, Lenora, and their infant son Thomas have no reflection. They are ghosts to the silvered glass. Why would a family, so perfectly captured in the emulsion of a photographic plate, cast no shadow in the looking-glass? The question hung in the air of the sterile, climate-controlled room where Elara Vance, a digital archivist specializing in historical media, first laid eyes on the album in print. It had arrived in a package from a man named Julian Croft, the great-great-grandson of the couple in the photograph. He was liquidating a forgotten branch of his family's estate and had found a small, leather-bound trunk containing a handful of artifacts. This photograph was chief among them. Family lore calls it the soulless print, Julian had written in an accompanying email. It was taken, then immediately hidden. No one ever spoke of it. I'm hoping you can tell me if it's a trick of the light, a chemical flaw, or something else entirely. Elara's initial assessment was purely technical. She placed the photograph under a high-resolution scanner, her fingers tracing the edges of the thick cardstock it was mounted on. The print was in remarkable condition, its sepia tones rich and largely unfaded. There were no obvious signs of manipulation. Composite photography existed in 1897, but it was a clumsy art, often leaving behind telltale seams, mismatched lighting, or unnatural outlines. This image was seamless. The lighting on the family was perfectly consistent with the light source reflected in the mirror. The shadows they cast upon the floor were crisp and correct. By all logical metrics, they were physically present in that room. Yet the mirror, an unforgiving witness, denied their existence. She zoomed in on the reflection, magnifying the pixels until they dissolved into a meaningless grid. The mirror showed the opposite wall, the edge of a changing table, the faint pattern of the rug. It was a perfect, empty reflection of the space behind the photographer. Elara cross-referenced the photographer's mark on the back of the mount: Alistair Finch, Portraits and Curiosities. Finch was a moderately successful photographer of his time, known for his crisp family portraits, not for dabbling in the then-popular genre of spirit photography. His work was grounded in reality. This anomaly was an aberration in his otherwise staid portfolio. Julian Croft had also sent along a small, velvet-covered journal, the diary of Lenora Croft, the woman in the rocking chair. Perhaps this will provide context, he'd suggested. Elara opened the book, the brittle pages whispering as they turned. The first entries were filled with the breathless joy of a new mother. October 12, 1896. Thomas is home. My heart has never known a feeling so immense. Silas carried him over the threshold, and our little house at once became a home. The nursery is finally complete. Silas hung the old mirror today, the one from his grandmother's estate. It is a magnificent piece with a frame of carved angels and ivy. It makes the room feel twice as large, a palace for our little prince. Elara paused. The mirror was a family heirloom, not just a piece of furniture. It had history. She continued reading, the entries chronicling the small, happy milestones of an infant's first year. But as the date approached that of the photograph, the tone began to shift. A subtle thread of anxiety wove itself into Lenora's elegant script. August 5th, 1897. A chill has settled in the nursery. Silas insists it is merely the autumn draft, but it is a cold that clings to the bones. Thomas has been fretful of late, especially in the evenings. He will not settle in his cradle. He cries and cries, his little eyes fixed on the wall where the mirror hangs. I picked him up tonight, and his gaze followed me. He was not looking at me, but at my reflection, as if the woman in the glass were a stranger. The entry sent a shiver down Elara's spine. She glanced back at the scanned photograph on her monitor. Lenora's smile, which at first had seemed serene, now looked strained. Her eyes held a deep, weary sadness. Silas's hand on her shoulder, once a gesture of protection, now seemed to be holding her in place, a gesture of restraint. August 14th, 1897. Mr. Finch came to take our family portrait today, a momentous occasion. We dressed Thomas in his christening gown. Silas was so proud. We arranged ourselves in the nursery, as it is the brightest room in the house. The process was arduous. The flash powder was blinding, its magnesium flare leaving spots in my vision. Thomas screamed after every flash. Mr. Finch was patient, but I felt a palpable sense of unease from him. He kept staring at the mirror, adjusting his camera, muttering about the light. I felt it too. A strange feeling of being observed, not by the camera's lens but by the cold glass on the wall behind us. This was the day the impossible photograph was created. Elara's heart beat faster. The journal was no longer just context. It was a real-time account of the anomaly's birth. The next entry was written a week later, the handwriting more hurried, less controlled. August 21st, 1897. Mr. Finch returned with the proofs. He was visibly distressed. He refused to come inside, meeting Silas on the porch. He presented only one print, the one we now possess. He called it an inexplicable failure. He said that on the glass plate negative, we are as clear as day, but our reflections are absent. He spoke of physics, of angles and light, but his words were hollow. I saw the fear in his eyes. He said it was against the laws of God and nature. He offered to destroy the plate and retake the portrait elsewhere at no cost. Silas, ever the pragmatist, was furious. He accused Mr. Finch of incompetence, of using flawed chemicals to cover his mistake. He paid him half his fee and sent him away. But I know what Mr. Finch saw. I know what he felt. The mirror watched us, and it did not approve. Tucked into the sleeve of the journal's back cover was a small folded piece of paper. It was a note, written on stationery bearing Alistair Finch's business letterhead. It was a formal, yet panicked, apology. Mr. Croft, it read, I must reiterate my profound apologies for the aberration in the portrait. I have spent a week consulting my manuals and colleagues, and no one can account for the phenomenon. The light entered the lens. It struck the plate, but the reflection it should have carried was simply not there. It is as if a shadow fell between you and the glass, a shadow visible only to my apparatus. I cannot in good conscience work in your home again. Please accept my refund and my sincerest regrets. Some things are not meant to be captured. Elara now had corroboration from two separate sources, the subject and the photographer. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't a mistake. It was a genuine, witnessed event. The photograph wasn't flawed. It was a perfect record of an impossible moment. Feeling out of her depth, she made a call. Dr. Eris Thorne was a leading expert in 19th-century photographic processes, a woman who treated chemical formulas and lens aberrations with the reverence of a historian reading ancient texts. She agreed to look at the high-resolution scan. Her initial reaction was one of academic skepticism. It's a composite, Miss Vance, Eris stated confidently over the phone. A clever one, I'll grant you. The family was likely photographed against a black screen and their image was later superimposed onto a photograph of the empty room. It's a common technique for so-called spirit photographs. There are no seams, Elara countered. The shadows on the floor are perfect. The focus is uniform. The grain matches exactly between the foreground and the reflected background. If it's a composite, it was made by a master, and Alistair Finch was no master of trickery. His work was conventional. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Elara could hear the faint clicking of a mouse as Eris presumably magnified the image again. The exposure time would have been several seconds at least, Eris mused, her tone shifting from certainty to curiosity. Magnesium flash would shorten it, but it would still be a significant duration. For the family to be so sharp, they had to remain perfectly still. For them to be absent from the mirror, they would have had to not be there. You cannot have both. It violates the basic principles of optics. The photons that bounced off the subjects and entered the camera lens should have been accompanied by the photons that bounced off the subjects, hit the mirror, and then entered the lens. They travel the same path. For one set to arrive and the other to vanish, it's not possible. "So what am I looking at?" Elara asked. "You're looking at a photograph of something that could not have happened," Eris replied, her voice now laced with a sense of wonder. "I can write a report on the chemical composition of the albumin, the make of the camera likely used, the physics of the light. But none of it will explain this. This image shouldn't exist." Armed with the knowledge that the photograph was a true scientific anomaly, Elara returned to Lenora's journal. The entries grew more erratic, more desperate. The beautiful script devolved into a fearful scrawl. September 3rd, 1897. I cannot bear to be in the nursery any longer. The mirror draws my eye. Sometimes when I pass the doorway, I catch a glimpse of movement in the glass, a flicker, a shadow where no shadow should be. I told Silas I saw a face in it last night, a pale, thin face looking out at me from the silver. He held me and told me it was just my own reflection, distorted by exhaustion. He doesn't believe me. He thinks the birth has unsettled my mind. He speaks of rest cures and doctors from the city. September 19th, 1897. Thomas screams whenever I take him near the mirror. A true, terrified scream. Today, I was holding him, trying to soothe him, and I saw it again. In the reflection, another woman was standing behind me. She was dressed in gray, her hair wild and dark. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. There was no one there. The room was empty. But in the mirror, she had been there. Her hand had been reaching for my son. Elara felt a cold dread creep up her arms. This was no longer a technical puzzle. It was a ghost story, written by the person living it. She read on, her own reflection in the dark monitor screen seeming to watch her. October 1st, 1897. Silas has covered the mirror. He did it for my sake, he said, to calm my nerves. He took one of my heavy velvet shawls and draped it over the frame. The room is darker now, quieter, but I do not feel safer. I feel as if something is trapped in there, waiting. The cold has not left the room. If anything, it is deeper. October 28th, 1897. It is all I can think about. What is behind the velvet? What does it see? Sometimes I hear a faint sound from the nursery, like the whisper of silk, even when the room is empty. I dream of it. I dream I am standing in a room of mirrors, and in every reflection is that pale woman, and she is holding a baby. But the baby is not Thomas. The baby is made of glass. Elara had to take a break. She walked to the window of her office, looking out at the modern city below, a world of steel and light so far removed from Lenora Croft's gaslit house of fears. She called Julian. "I've been reading her journal," Elara said, her voice low. She was terrified of that mirror. Julian was quiet for a moment. "I didn't read it all," he admitted. "It felt too personal. I know how the story ends for them. It's the tragedy of our family. My grandfather told me about it once. Infant Thomas. He disappeared. disappeared. Vanished, Julian confirmed, his voice heavy with inherited sadness. From his cradle. One night in the winter of 1897. There was a snowstorm, so he couldn't have wandered off. The doors were locked. The windows were barred. They searched for weeks. The police, the townspeople, everyone. They never found a trace of him. My great-great-grandmother, Lenora, she lost her mind. They said she just kept pointing at the nursery wall, repeating the words, "The mirror took him." She was committed to an asylum a month later. Silas sold the house and everything in it. He moved away and never spoke of his wife or son again. That photograph and the journal were with Lenora's sister, which is how they survived and ended up with my branch of the family. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying certainty. Elara looked at the photograph, at the sleeping baby in the cradle, and felt a profound sense of grief. This wasn't just an image, it was an omen. She returned to the journal, her hands trembling slightly as she turned to the last few pages. November 15th, 1897. I saw it today. I couldn't resist. Silas was at his office. The house was quiet. I went into the nursery and I pulled the cover from the mirror. I had to know. For a moment, there was just my own reflection, a haggard, frightened woman I barely recognized. But then it changed. The room in the glass began to alter. The wallpaper, our beautiful cherubs, it was peeling. The wooden toys were gone. The cradle was empty, and standing over it was a figure, its back to me. A woman in a gray, tattered dress. The room was the same, but not. It was the future. A future of decay and loss. I covered the glass and ran. I must tell Silas. He must believe me now. But the final entry, dated the next day, was a single, devastating sentence. The ink smudged as if by a tear or a melting snowflake. November 16th, 1897. The cover is off the mirror. Thomas is gone. The rest of the pages were blank. Elara stared at the screen, at the image of the happy family frozen in time, forever on the precipice of their destruction. The empty reflection in the mirror was no longer just a void. It was a warning. It was a prophecy. The camera hadn't failed to capture their reflection. It had captured the truth more deeply than any human eye could. It had captured the absence that was to come. Driven by a final, chilling hypothesis, Elara opened the scanned image in an advanced forensic analysis program. The software was designed to pull detail from shadows and highlights, to reveal what was hidden in the noise of an old photograph. She isolated the mirror. The reflected room was dark, underexposed compared to the brightly lit family. She began to manipulate the levels, pushing the brightness, clarifying the contrast, filtering out the chemical grain of the original print. The image inside the mirror became clearer. It was, as Lenora had described, the same nursery, but in a state of neglect. The wallpaper with the cherubs was visibly water-stained and peeling near the window. A fine layer of dust seemed to coat every surface. The cradle, which in the foreground held the sleeping infant, Thomas, was starkly, terrifyingly empty in the reflection. The camera had captured two moments in one frame, the vibrant present and the desolate future. Elara zoomed in further, pushing the software to its absolute limit, focusing on the space right above the reflected cradle where Lenora had seen the figure. The digital noise coalesced. Pixels fought to resolve into a coherent shape. It was faint, a ghost in the machine, but it was there. A tall, slender smudge of darkness. It had a vaguely humanoid shape, but no discernible features. It was a pillar of shadow, a form of pure absence, leaning over the place where the baby should have been. It was the embodiment of loss. The mirror wasn't showing a reflection. It was showing an erasure. It was showing the exact moment, in a future of decay, where the family had been removed from the picture, leaving behind only an empty room and the chilling specter of their grief. The photograph was not a record of a family that cast no reflection. It was a record of a family about to be replaced by one. The mirror didn't ignore them. It saw through them. to the heartbreaking emptiness that would soon consume their lives. The long exposure didn't just capture a moment, it captured a timeline, layering the happy now over the tragic later, creating an image that was both a portrait and a tombstone. Lenora wasn't descending into madness. She was the only one who understood the warning hanging on her nursery wall. The most terrifying ghosts aren't the ones that haunt us from the past, but the ones that show us a future we are powerless to stop. To see more artifacts that defy explanation, subscribe to our channel.